There is a grave on a rise above the Sweetwater country in Wyoming, and the woman buried under it was once told to her face, in front of 19 hard men, that she was the wrong woman, that she was nobody's idea of a wife, that the wagon would carry her back where she came from come Monday, and good riddance. The man who said it lived long enough to ride 40 miles through a killing snow to fetch a doctor for her, and to weep at the foot of that bed like a child, and to keep her stove warm for 30 winters after she was gone, because he could not bear to let it go cold. But that is the end of it, and the end of a thing is no place to start. The start is a wagon coming up a frozen road in the last good week of the fall of 1886, carrying a plain widow and a small girl and one worn carpet bag into a yard where not one living soul wanted them. Stay with me, because by the time the first snow falls in this story, you will understand why every man on that ranch took off his hat to her, and why the one who told her to leave would have crawled over broken glass to make her stay. The wagon from the rail stop at Bitter Creek came up the Willow Draw Road a little before noon, and Aaron Vane did not go out to meet it. He stood in the door of the ranch house with his hat in his two hands and watched the woman climb down over the wheel on her own. She had a carpet bag worn pale at the corners in one fist and a small girl's hand in the other. She set the bag down in the frozen dust the way a person sets down a thing they have carried a long way, with both hands and a kind of care, as though even the bag had earned a moment's rest. Then she straightened her back, and she looked at the house, and she looked at the man in the doorway, and she did not look away. Aaron had pictured someone else. He could not have told you who. Younger, maybe. A face that weather and grief had not already gotten to. The woman in his yard was plain as a fence post. Her brown hair was pulled back hard beneath a bonnet gone gray at the brim. Her traveling dress was mended at the cuff, the stitches so small a man would have to know to look for them, and even then he might miss them. The child against her skirt was thin and watchful and had her mother's same steady eyes, eyes that took the measure of a place before they trusted it. Lon Cruz, the wagon boss, leaned on the top corral rail with a dead cigarette pinched between two fingers. He looked the woman over once, slow, from the bonnet to the mended hem, and he said it loud enough to carry across the whole yard. "That the bride, Aaron? Thought you sent off for a cook, not somebody's wore-out aunt." Two of the younger hands laughed before they knew any better, and one of them quit when he saw that nobody else kept it up. And the quitting was somehow worse than the laugh, because it meant even the young fools could feel the cruelty of it once it was out in the cold air. The woman did not flinch. That was the first thing about her that a watching man might have marked, if any of them had been the kind to mark such things, and one of them was. She heard the word aunt land in the dust at her feet, and she let it lie there, and she did not so much as tighten her mouth. She had been called worse by better men, and she had buried two of them, and she had learned somewhere on a long road that you do not answer a thing like that with words. You answer it with time. You outlast it the way a stone outlasts the water that means to wear it down. Her name was Cora Halloran, and she had come a very long way to a place that did not want her. Now, I could tell you all at once who she was and where she had been, the whole sad freight of her, and you would nod and forget it. Instead, I am going to let you find it out the way the men on that ranch found it out, a piece at a time, until the day one of them turns around in a warm kitchen and says 4 words that put the whole of her together at last. Keep that in the back of your mind. There is a man in this story who has already met Cora Halloran, years before this wagon ever climbed the Willow Draw Road, and he does not yet know it, and neither do you. When he remembers, you will feel it go through you like cold water. Hold on for that. Aaron Vane showed her the house, and he did not pretend it was more than it was. 3 rooms and a dog trot and a lean-to off the back where the meat hung in the cold months. The kitchen had not been swept in better than a week. The stove was dead and gray. A film of old grease lay over everything the last cook had left behind, and the air had that close, sour smell a room gets when no woman has had the keeping of it and no man has cared. On a shelf above the dry sink there was a woman's sewing basket and a hairbrush with a few pale hairs caught in it still, set there and not touched, the way the belongings of the dead are sometimes left to keep a kind of watch over the living. Cora's eyes went to them and moved on, and she did not say anything, and she did not touch them then, nor for a long while after, because she knew a shrine when she saw one, and she knew you do not lay your hand on another woman's grief uninvited. By the cold hearth, a one-eyed cow-dog lay in the dead ashes and did not get up. It rolled its one good eye toward the strangers and then away, the way an old creature does when it has decided that nothing new is likely to be good. "My wife kept it better," Aaron said. He said it without softness, the way a man states a fact he has handled so many times it has gone smooth and shapeless in his hands. Ellen passed 2 winters back. The cook held it together after, more or less, till he went. Old Pruitt, he's a week in the ground now, and the fall gather starts Monday. He turned his hat once in his hands and looked at the dead stove instead of at her. "I'll be straight with you, Mrs. Halloran. I sent off for a woman who could keep this place and feed my outfit. I didn't rightly think on a child. The wagon goes back to the rail Monday at noon. You'd best think hard on whether you mean to be on it." It was an ugly thing to say to a woman who had just climbed down off a 40-mile freight wagon with everything she owned in one bag, and Aaron Vane knew it was ugly even as he said it, and he said it anyway, because he had built his life these 2 years on saying the hard thing first so that no soft thing could ever sneak up on him from behind. He had buried Ellen, and he had walled the grief up brick by brick and moved in behind the wall on purpose, and he did not mean for any plain widow's mended cuffs to talk him out from behind it. Pearl had crossed the dirty floor to the dog. She did it without being told and without a sound, the way the child did most things. She sat down on the cold boards in front of the old dog and held her small hand out flat before its nose, palm up, the careful way a child offers herself to an animal she does not yet trust and badly wants to. And the dog, who had not got up for the boss, nor for the dead cook's burying, nor for anything else in a hard, long while, opened its one good eye and looked at the small, flat hand. It did not pull away. Cora saw it. A mother sees everything her child does, even when she is looking at a dead stove and a strange, hostile man. And Cora saw her daughter make the first friend either of them had made in this whole wide, cold country, and it was a half-blind cow-dog lying in the ashes. She looked at her girl, and she looked at the stove, and she looked at the man who had already half decided to send her back down a road to nowhere, because there was nowhere, there was no people, there was no town that would take in a widow and a child with $4 silver between them, and the winter coming on. The wagon that went back to the rail Monday went back to a depot, and from the depot to a wider nothing than the one she stood in now. She knew all that, standing there, and she did not say any of it, because a woman does not bargain from a place of begging if she can find any other place at all to stand. She found another place to stand. "I'll cook you a supper tonight," she said. Her voice was low and even, and gave away not one thing. "Then you can decide what you decide." She set her bag in the corner. She took off her bonnet and hung it on the nail by the door. She rolled her sleeves back past her forearms, and her forearms were not soft, and a man who knew work when he saw it might have read something in them. But Aaron Vane was looking at his dead wife's sewing basket and did not see. She did not wait to be shown where things were. That was the second thing about her worth the marking. She found the broom on her own, and she found the lye soap, and she found the wood, and she set that filthy kitchen to rights with the plain, hard motion of a woman who has cleaned a great many kitchens that were not her own, and expected to clean a great many more before she was through. She got the firebox cleaned of its cold clinkers, and the chimney drawing and a blaze going. She scrubbed the long table and the dry sink, and then she got down on her knees and scrubbed the floor down to the grain of the boards, and the gray water she carried out and threw steaming into the yard 3 times before the water came back clean. Out in the lean-to, by the hanging side of beef, she found a heap of sprouting onions and a sack of pinto beans and a slab of salt pork gone a little soft. She found a crock of sourdough starter pushed back in a corner, and when she lifted the cloth off it, she stood a moment looking down into it, because the old man who had kept it was a week in the ground, and the starter under its gray crust was still faintly, stubbornly alive, sour and breathing, a living thing the dead cook had carried along for who knew how many years, and had very nearly taken into the grave with him. She fed it a little flour and a little warm water and set it where it would not freeze, the way you would see to a sick animal, and she did not yet know she would have such great need of it so soon. By the time the light was failing, she had a great pot of beans on, with an onion and the salt pork worked through it, and a pan of cornbread baking golden in the oven she had brought back from the dead, and coffee that did not taste like the bottom of a creek bed. The kitchen that had been cold and sour and gray was warm, and the windows had begun to sweat against the dusk, and the one-eyed dog had moved a little closer to the stove. The near-pasture hands came in at dark. There were 5 of them, and Lon Cruz, and an old man they called Sweeney. They came stamping the cold off their boots in the dog trot, blowing into their fists, and they came into the kitchen and stopped, because it did not smell the way it had smelled for a week. And there was a table scrubbed pale and laid with tin plates, and there was a woman in a flour sack apron at the stove with a small girl carrying the cups. They sat. They ate what she set down. They drank her coffee, and most of them said nothing at all, because saying nothing was the way of them, and a man does not hand out praise to a cook he expects to be gone by Monday. But the old one, Sweeney, said something. He was the oldest hand on the place, a bow-legged man with a white mustache stained yellow at the corners, and a way of sitting so still through a meal that the young ones took it for sleep, and had learned, more than once and to their cost, that it was not sleep. He had watched her the whole way through the supper. He had watched her hands, and the set of her back at the stove, and the way the little girl carried the cups to the table 2 at a time without being told, and without spilling. And somewhere in that watching a thing had stirred in the old man that he could not yet name. At the end of the meal he wiped his plate clean with the last of his cornbread, and he set the bread down, and he looked up the table at her. "Where'd you learn to cook, ma'am?" "Kansas," Cora said. She did not stop what she was doing, which was filling the coffee pot again. "Railroad camp." Sweeney nodded, slow. He did not say anything more. But something had shifted behind the old man's eyes and gone quiet and settled, the way silt settles in still water and shows you, all at once, how deep down the bottom really is. Remember the old man. Remember that he was on a railroad grade once, in a year I have not told you yet, eating a kind of bread he has not forgotten in 5 years. He has not put it together. Give him until the snow. Lon Cruz pushed his plate back and tipped his chair onto its 2 hind legs and got ready to be clever, the way a certain kind of man always gets ready to be clever the moment a meal has warmed him enough to spare the strength for it. "Beans is one thing," he said. "Any woman alive can boil a pot of beans. Feeding a gather is a whole other animal, ma'am. Old Pruitt put up a noon meal for 20 riders out of a chuck wagon, hot, on the open ground, in the wind, every single day of the works, and it broke harder men than him before they were done with it. No offense meant, but that there ain't a wore-out widow's kind of work." Cora was pouring the coffee, and she did not stop pouring. "None taken," she said. She filled his cup, though he had not asked for it, and she filled it to the brim, and a hair passed, so that he had to bend and sip from the top of it before he could lift it, and she went on down the table, filling the others, and the laugh that Lon Cruz had been building up behind his teeth, the laugh he meant to let loose the moment she rose to the bait, found that there was no bait, and nothing to push against, and nowhere to go, and it died quietly in his chest before he could get it out into the room. He looked into his too full cup. He was a man who had not lost a contest of words in some years, and he had the dim, irritating sense of having just lost one without a single shot being fired, and he could not for the life of him have told you how. That was Friday. "I want you to hold on to Friday," because everything in this story turns on the distance between this Friday night, with Lon Cruz smirking into his coffee, and Aaron Vane walled up in his grief, and 19 men betting on how soon the widow would be gone, and the Friday a week on, when those same men will be standing bareheaded in this same kitchen with the wind screaming outside, and not one of them able to look straight at her for the size of the thing she has done. That is the road we are walking. It is not a long road in miles. It is the longest kind of road there is. Now I will tell you who she was, because you have earned a little of it, and because the man who will say the 4 words is sitting at that table right now, finishing his coffee and trying to remember. Cora Halloran was 32 years old, though the road had laid more than 32 years on her face, and she had buried her husband on a Kansas railroad grade in the spring before the last. John Halloran had been a steady man with good hands and a bad lung, and the fever that ran through the construction camp like fire through dry grass took him in 9 days, faster than anyone could send for a doctor who would not have come anyway, not for a track laborer, not for the wages the company paid. They laid John in the hard prairie ground with 16 other men that same season in a row, with stones too small for their names, and a line foreman with a ledger came to the cook tent where Cora sat with her child and gave her $3 silver and a week to clear out. She did not clear out. She stayed and she cooked because the gang of 40 men still wanted feeding twice a day, and the new foreman could not turn up another living soul who would do it for what the company was willing to pay, so she fed them. She fed them out of a sheet iron camp stove and 3 Dutch ovens, and that same sourdough crock she kept warm against her own body on the cold nights, sleeping with it like a second child so the starter would not die in the dark. And she fed them well enough that hard men who had never once thanked her in their lives began, one and then another, to take their hats off when they came down the line for their plates. She had learned the work the only way anybody ever learns work that hard, which is by doing it past the point of being able, and then getting up the next gray morning and doing it again. She learned to stretch a single barrel of flour across a month. She learned to make a tough old range cow eat tender. She learned to bake good bread on the open ground in a wind that wanted to scatter her fire across 3 counties. And she learned all of it with Pearl underfoot, her girl, 5 years old that summer, who could crack an egg clean into a bowl one-handed before she knew the whole of her letters. When the grade pushed on west and the camp folded up behind it like a tent struck in the night, there was no more work for a cook because there was no more camp. There was a widow and a child and $4 silver and not one human being anywhere in the whole turning world who was obliged to take them in. That was the long and the short of how she came to answer the notice. A storekeeper's wife down in Rawlins, a kind, busy, managing woman named Mrs. Avery, had set a few lines in the matrimonial paper on behalf of a stockman up in the Sweetwater country who had lost his wife 2 winters back, and lost his old cook on top of it that very fall, and who wanted a woman to run his house and feed the men who worked his range. The notice had not promised love and had not pretended to. It was an honest notice for an honest, hard arrangement, and Cora had answered it in a plain, steady hand on a torn half-sheet of paper, and she had told the whole truth in it, because the truth was the only thing she had left that was worth anything in a bargain. She wrote that she was a widow with a daughter she would not, under any arrangement on this earth, leave behind. She wrote that she was no beauty and laid no claim to be one, and would not have the man imagine otherwise and feel cheated when she stepped down off the wagon. She wrote that she could cook for a crowd and keep a house clean and was not afraid of hard country nor of hard men, having buried herself in both. The letter that came back was 4 lines long in a heavy, careful, laboring hand, the hand of a man who did not write often and did not enjoy it. It said the writer's name was Aaron Vane. It said he ran cattle on a place called the Willow Draw up in the Sweetwater country of Wyoming. It said the work would be steady and the pay would be her keep and a home for as long as she did the work well. It said the fair was enclosed and she could come or not as she chose. There had been a banknote folded inside it. There had not been one single word in those 4 lines about a child. Cora had read that letter a dozen times on the long road north, in the jolting passenger car and on the freight wagon and by the light of bad candles in worse rooms, turning it over and over, trying to read in the spaces between the four careful lines whether the man had made his peace with Pearl or whether he had simply read past the fact of her, the way a tired man's eye slides over a word he does not want to take in. And now, standing in his swept-out yard with her bag in the frozen dust and his face in the doorway gone tight and disappointed, she had her answer. He had read past her. He had not let the child land at all. And she thought, watching him turn his hat in his hands and look at his dead wife's sewing basket instead of at the living girl on his floor. He did not read me close. He read what he wanted and skipped what he feared, the way frightened people do. And now he is standing in his fear and calling it a hard decision. She did not hold it against him as much as you might think. She had been frightened, too, in her time. She knew what fear made of a person. But she did not intend to climb back onto that wagon Monday and ride down to the depot and the wider nothing beyond it. Not while there was a stove in this house and a sack of beans in the lean-to and one supper's worth of time to change a frightened man's mind. So she had cooked the supper, and she would cook the breakfast, and she would cook until either he sent her down the road by main force or he forgot he had ever meant to. She lay that first night on a pallet in the lean-to room off the kitchen with Pearl warm against her and the one-eyed dog, who had got up from the hearth at last and followed the warmth and the child, curled at their feet, where it had not lain for any living soul in 2 years. And she listened to the strange house tick and settle in the cold, and she did not let herself want anything, because wanting was a luxury for people with somewhere to fall, and she had nowhere, and she had learned the hard way that a woman with nowhere to fall had better keep her 2 feet under her and her 2 eyes open, and want nothing she had not already earned twice over. On Saturday, the men of the near outfit watched her the way men watch a thing they have already made up their minds will not last. She heard 2 of them by the corral, a pair of young hands named Deke and Roy, betting plug tobacco on how many days it would be before the boss put her on the wagon. Roy said Monday. Deke gave it till the gather was over, on the grounds that no man sends his cook away in the middle of the works, even a cook he means to be rid of, and they argued the fine points of it the way men will argue anything to pass a cold morning, and neither one of them dropped his voice when she came out to hang the wash on the line strung between the bunkhouse and the smoke shed. They did not drop their voices because it did not occur to either of them that the woman they were wagering over was a person who might mind the hearing of it. She was a fixture to them, like the stove or the wagon, a thing the ranch had acquired and might soon get rid of. Cora hung her wash and Pearl's small dresses beside it, the cloth going stiff in the wind almost before she had the pins on it, and she said nothing because a person cannot argue a thing like that. She could not walk over to the corral and inform 2 grinning boys that she meant to last. Telling a man you mean to last is the surest way in the world to look like you fear you will not. You can only do the lasting, day on day, until the betting stops on its own for shame. So she did the lasting. She kept the house, and she kept to herself, and she did not touch Ellen Vane's sewing basket, nor her hairbrush, and she made a point that Pearl should not touch them either, and she explained to the girl in a low voice while they shelled beans that the things on the high shelf belonged to a lady who had died, and that you left such things be, the way you would leave be a flower somebody had laid on a grave. Pearl, who missed nothing, looked up at the shelf and then at her mother, and nodded as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world, and she never once reached for them. Cora was gentle with the half-broke Wrangler boy, a thin, stuttering child of maybe 15 named Tobe, whom the older hands rode hard about his stammer in the careless way of men who have forgotten they were ever young and frightened. She did not make a show of being kind to him, which would have shamed him worse than the teasing. She simply gave him the same level voice she gave everyone and the first plate when he came in cold, and did not finish his words for him when he caught on one, but waited, with her hands still, until he got it out. And Tobe, who had not been waited for by a grown person in a long time, began to find reasons to be near the kitchen. and she was gentle with the old one-eyed dog who had begun by Saturday evening to follow her from the stove to the woodpile and back, and to lie where she would step over it, which is a dog's whole way of saying that it has chosen you. Aaron Vane saw none of it. Or he made himself not see it, which is a different thing and harder work. He came into his meals and ate them in a silence of his own, and he went back out to his work. And the house that had gone cold and quiet inside him after Ellen stayed cold and quiet inside him even now, with a fire in the stove and a child's voice in the next room and good bread on the table, because he had built his grief into a wall on purpose and meant to live behind it. And a wall does not come down because somebody on the far side of it is baking. But Sweeney saw, and the boy Tobe saw, and Pearl, who missed nothing, saw a very great deal and said none of it. On Saturday night, the child carried Aaron Vane's coffee out to him, where he sat alone on the porch step in the dark. Nobody had told her to. Her mother had not told her to. Her mother would not have presumed. The girl simply saw that the man had gone out into the cold without his coffee, the way she saw most things, and she poured it carefully into his cup and carried it out the way her mother had taught her to carry a full cup, in both hands, with her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and she set it down on the boards by his boot without a word, and she went back inside. And Aaron Vane sat out there in the dark with that cup of coffee going cold beside him for a long, long time, and he did not drink it, and he could not have told you, if you had asked him with a gun to his head, why his throat had closed up the way it had at the sight of a strange child setting a cup by his boot in the dark. He had wanted no child. He had said so, plain, in his own yard, in front of his men. And here was the child, asking nothing, expecting nothing, doing him a small kindness in the cold and walking away from it. And the smallness of it was what undid him, because grief can stand against great blows and break against small kindnesses, and any man who is truly grieved knows it. That night the wind changed. He felt it before he heard it. A man who has wintered on the high Wyoming plains feels a norther coming up out of the northwest while the stars are still showing, the way an old wound feels the weather. A hard, dry shifting in the air, a smell to it like cold iron and far-off snow. He sat on his porch step with a dead child's father's grief in his throat and a dead cold cup of coffee by his boot, and he felt the great weather wheeling down off the divide toward his country, and some old cattleman's part of him that never slept began, even then, even buried as he was, to count his exposure and reckon his herd and worry. He did not yet know the half of what was coming. Neither do you, quite. The winter that was bearing down on the Sweetwater country that night was not an ordinary winter. The old men in that country would speak of it for the rest of their lives in the same hushed way men speak of a war they barely lived through. But that is ahead of us. On Saturday night it was only a wind and a man on a porch and a cup going cold. By Sunday morning the sky had gone the color of dirty wool, and the temperature was falling a degree an hour, steady, like something being let down a well on a rope. A horseback rider came in off the range a little after noon, with his collar turned up and his face raw and bled white at the cheekbones to bring the word. The gather outfit was 2 full days out on the works with better than 1,000 head bunched and moving slow. They would push the herd down into the home pasture, and the men would ride in Monday around midday, froze to the bone and hollow as gourds, 2 nights on the cold ground behind them and a falling glass over their heads. There were 15 riders out there, and a chuck wagon, and the horse wrangler with the remuda, and lawn crews who would come in ahead of the herd, and every last one of them would come off that cold open range looking for one thing above their own mothers, which was hot food and a fire, and they would find, if nothing on God's earth changed between now and then, neither. Because the man Aaron Vane had counted on to cook the works in old Pruitt's place had failed him. A wagon cook named Reyes, a Mexican who had fed outfits up and down the Sweetwater and the Sandy for 20 years and was worth his own weight in shipped beef, had sent word by the freighter that he had taken on with a big English-owned outfit over on the Sweetwater proper for the season, better wages, and would not be coming up to the Willow Draw after all. The word had come Friday. Aaron had said nothing of it to anyone because there had seemed to be a week to solve it, and now there was not a week. There was the rest of Sunday. He stood in the dog trot that Sunday evening with that news sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone and the wind beginning to moan low and steady in the eaves, and he understood the trouble he was in all the way down to the bottom of it. Come noon tomorrow, 16 men were going to ride into his yard out of the first hard norther of the fall. Men who rode for his brand and trusted him to have thought of this. And there was not a soul on the whole of his place who could feed them. There was not a soul who could put up a hot meal for 16 frozen men, except a woman he had told in this very yard 2 days ago to think hard about whether she meant to be on Monday's wagon out. He stood in the dog trot a long while, and the cold came up through his boots, and his pride and his fear had it out between them where no one could see, and his fear won, the way it generally does in a man with 16 hungry riders bearing down on him, and he turned and went into the kitchen. Cora was there. She had a lamp lit against the early dark, and she was mending a tear in the hem of Pearl's good dress with stitches so small they vanished, and the child was already asleep on a folded quilt by the stove, and the one-eyed dog was stretched out long and warm beside the girl on the hearth, in the very place where it had not lain for any living soul in 2 years, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of bread, and the lamp threw a soft yellow ring over the whole of it, and it looked, God help him, like a home. Like the thing he had walled away from himself on purpose, and the sight of it stopped Aaron Vane in his own doorway with his hat in his hand. There was no part of him that wanted to ask this woman for anything. He had told her to think on leaving. He had stood in his pride and named her child an inconvenience and her own self a poor bargain, near enough. And now he had to walk across his own kitchen floor and lay his whole outfit's belly in her 2 hands and hope. He braced himself for her to flinch from it, or to make some small, modest woman's noise about not being equal to such a thing, or to seize the chance and bargain hard, or to gloat. He had no idea which he dreaded most. He stood in the door and he asked her the only question he had left in the world to ask. "Can you cook for a whole outfit?" He meant it half as a challenge, the way a cornered, proud man will, and half as a drowning man's reach for any hand at all in the dark water, and he hated himself a little for both halves of it. He waited. Cora set her needle down in her lap. She did not flinch, and she did not gloat, and she made no small, modest noise. She looked at him level across the lamplight with her plain, steady face, the face Lon Cruz had called a wore-out ant's, and she asked him 2 questions of her own, in the flat, practical voice of a person who has already, somewhere deep inside herself, rolled up her sleeves. "How many men, and what time do they ride in?" It stopped him cold. It was not any of the things he had braced for. It was the question a person asks who has already, in the half-second since he opened his mouth, said yes inside themselves and moved straight past it to the work. He had not known what he expected. It had not been that. 16, he said. Noon, give or take what the weather does to them. And then, because she was waiting and the asking steadied him too, he found he was telling her the rest. What have you got, in the stores, to work with? Flour, beans, coffee, dried apples, sugar, salt. She told it off without looking, having taken inventory of that lean-to the way she took inventory of everything on her first walk through it. A side of beef hung in the lean-to, a steer on the hoof if you want fresh killed, lard, a jug of sorghum molasses, near full. Cora nodded. It was a small nod, certain, the nod of a person who has already begun, somewhere inside, to do the thing. She set the mending aside and rose, and she reached up and took down old Pruitt's flour sack apron from its nail by the door, the dead cook's apron, and without one word of explanation, she tied it on over the apron she already wore. 2 aprons now, as though she were girding for something, and a watching man might have understood that she was. "I'll want the wrangler to kill that steer tonight and hang it to cool," she said. "And the boy, Tobe, to keep me in dry mesquite and cottonwood till morning, all night, however much he can split. Go on to bed, Mr. Vane." She said it not unkindly, the way you would dismiss a man who was no further used to the task and would only be in the road of it. "There'll be food when they come." And Aaron Vane, who had not been told to go to bed in his own house by anyone in 2 years, went. She did not sleep that night, nor mean to. She got the sourdough working first, because the bread was the heart of the whole thing, the one part that could not be hurried at the end nor done without. She lifted the cloth from old Pruitt's crock again, and the starter she had fed and saved on Friday had come up alive and sour and game under her hand, breathing, ready, the dead man's long care still living in it, and she said a low word of thanks over it that was half to the old man in his weak old grave, and half to God, and half to nobody at all, the way a person talks to the thing under their hands at 2 in the morning to keep their own 2 hands steady. She fed it more flour and more warm water and set it close to the stove to climb, and she talked to it low while she worked, not because the crock could hear her, but because the talking steadied her, the way it had steadied her on the cold Kansas nights when she had no other living soul awake in the dark to talk to at all, and the talking and the work were the same medicine they had always been. She set the beans to soak in the great iron pot with the strips of salt pork laid across the top of them. She rendered lard in a kettle till the cracklings went brown and the kitchen filled with the rich smell of it. She took the lantern and went out into the cold to where Toby had killed and hung the fresh steer, the boy working in the dark and the rising wind without one word of complaint, because she had asked him plain and waited for his stammered yes. And she cut from the warm carcass what she needed for the dish the men on the Kansas grade had called by a name I will leave to your imagination, made of the heart and the liver and the sweetbreads and the marrow gut, all of it cleaned and cut down small and set to simmer long and slow with onion and a fistful of dried red chilies she had turned up in a corner of the lean-to, because a stew built like that one fed cold men from the inside out in a way that plain boiled beef never could, and she had learned that on a grade in Kansas from a man who was dead now, and she carried his knowing forward into a Wyoming kitchen the way the sourdough carried old Pruitt forward, the living quietly freighting the dead. She built the cobbler in the deepest Dutch oven on the place. Dried apples plumped soft in hot water and sugar, with a long, dark pour of the sorghum worked all through them, and a thick biscuit crust laid over the whole and crimped down at the edges, and she set the oven where it would bake low and slow and even through the small hours of the night, and need only watching, not tending. The kitchen grew warm and then hot. The windows ran with steam against the cold that was pressing harder and harder on the far side of the glass, and out beyond the steam the wind picked up and began to worry at the eaves and the loose shake on the smoke-shed roof, and Pearl slept on by the stove with her rag doll in the crook of one arm, and the one-eyed dog curled into the warm hollow of the child's back, and Cora Halloran worked on alone in the lamplight in the middle of the rising storm, 2 aprons tied over her plain dress, and somewhere in the deep of that night, with her hands in the dough, she stopped being afraid. She could not have told you the moment it happened, but there came a moment, somewhere past 2 o'clock, with the bread climbing, and the stew gone dark, and the wind throwing itself against the house, when the fear that had ridden her all the long way north from Kansas, the low, gnawing fear of the woman with nowhere to fall, simply was not in the room with her anymore. She knew this work. She knew it the way she knew her own daughter's breathing in the dark. Let the wind do its worst, and the men ride in froze, and the proud man in the next room think whatever he thought. She knew this work, and the knowing of it was a floor under her 2 feet at last, and she stood on it, and she baked. When the dough had come up the first time, she punched it down and let it climb a second time, and along about 4 o'clock in the deep, killing cold of the morning she began to bake the biscuits, pan after pan. Dutch ovens set down into beds of glowing coals, with more hot coals heaped onto the lids, the only way there is to do it right for a crowd that will eat on the ground. And she kept each batch warm as it came off, wrapped in flour sacking and stacked in the warming oven and set on the back of the stove. And the last and largest batch she buried in a crock down in a wooden box of hot sand, where bread will hold its heat for hours. A trick she had off a German cook on the grade who was also dead now. The dead, all of them, crowding helpful into her warm kitchen in the small hours, lending her their hands. By the time the black in the east began to thin to a hard gray, she had 4 dozen biscuits laid by, tall and golden and split along their tops where they had risen. The great pot of stew had cooked down dark and thick and smelling of beef fat and chilly heat. The cobbler crust had risen brown and cracked open over the bubbling apples beneath. The coffee was set ready to boil, and the storm had come down out of the northwest in earnest and laid its hand flat over the whole country. She washed her face in cold water at the basin. She retied her hair, which had come down with the heat and the work. She put a clean third apron on over the other two. She woke Pearl gently and gave her bread and warm milk and a kiss on the crown of her head, and she set the child to laying out the tin plates and the cups down the long scrubbed table, and the girl did it carefully and well, two at a time, the way she did everything. And then there was nothing left to do but feed the fire and wait. Cora stood at the steamed-up window with her raw red hands wrapped around a cup of her own coffee and watched the cold gray morning come up hard and mean over a country that did not yet know what she could do. She was not afraid. She was past being afraid. She was so tired her bones rang, and she was past that too. There was only the work, finished and waiting and good, and the storm, and the men somewhere out in it, riding in. They came in the teeth of it. The norther had its full claws down by midday, the wind out of the northwest hard enough to lay the dead grass flat to the ground, and a fine cutting sleet riding in it that stung the bare skin like blown sand, and gathered in the lee of every post and stone. The herd had been thrown down into the home pasture, and the gates shut behind it, and the riders came up the willow draw road bunched and bent low over their horses' necks, their collars turned up and their hats jammed down and tied on, the horses' manes streaming sideways off their necks in the wind. 16 cold and hollowed-out men who had spent 2 nights on the open ground in a falling glass, and who were riding in expecting, at the very best they let themselves hope for, cold leftovers handed out grudging by a hired woman who knew nothing of their work and would likely be gone by the time they got back from the next day's gather anyhow. They smelled it before they saw it. The wind, for once a friend, carried it out down the road to meet them. The smell of beef and chili and coffee and fresh-baked bread laid warm over all that cold, and a young hand named Deke, the same who had bet plug tobacco on Monday, lifted his frozen face up into the wind and said, "What in the round world is that?" And not one man among them answered him, because not one of them wanted to say the thing out loud and name the hope, and then ride on in and find it was not so, find it was some trick of a cold man's wishing, and have the hope taken back. So they rode on in silence with the smell pulling them up the road like a rope. They came into the yard and swung down stiff and clumsy off their horses, and led them to the corral with hands too cold and swollen to work the latches, fumbling. And then they came back across the lot, stamping and beating their arms across their chests and blowing into their fists. And they came up to the long, low kitchen where old Pruitt had fed them all those years, and they stopped dead in the doorway, all of them bunching up behind the first ones because of what was in there. There was a fire roaring in the stove. There was a table laid the whole length of the room. There was a tin platter heaped high with split golden biscuits at each end of it, and a kettle of dark stew steaming on the trivet, and a Dutch oven of apple cobbler with its lid off and the steam standing straight up out of it, and there was hot black coffee, and there was a plain woman in 3 flour sack aprons standing by the stove with a small girl at her side, and she looked at the bunched-up frozen men in her doorway, and she said the simplest thing there was to say. "Come in out of it and sit down. There's plenty, and there's more on the stove." For a long moment, not one man moved. Then old Sweeney took off his hat. He did it slow, and he did it without a word, and the others saw him do it, and one by one, the way a thing moves down a line, the others took theirs off after him. 16 cold men bearing their heads in a warm kitchen to a plain widow in 3 aprons, and not one of them could have told you he had decided to do it. It was done before deciding. And they came to the long table and sat down on the benches, and Cora began to fill the plates. She filled them high. She filled them high. She went down the long table, ladling the dark stew into the tin plates, and Pearl came along behind her, laying down biscuits, 2 to a plate, the way she had laid out the cups, careful and unhurried, and the men took up their forks, and the room went quiet. It went quiet the way a thing goes quiet when something is happening that nobody wants to be the one to break. There was the scrape of forks on tin, and the snap and settle of the fire, and the wind worrying the eaves, and the loose shake on the smoke-shed roof, and under all of it, the small, private sounds of cold and starving men eating hot food. And not one word spoken anywhere along the bench. A rider near the middle, a hard old waddy named Tomlin, with a face like a dropped saddle and hands like two roots of oak, took up a biscuit and broke it open, and the steam rose up out of the heart of it, white in the lamplight, and he laid a little butter in and ate the half of it in one bite, and then he stopped chewing. He sat very still with his eyes down on his plate, and the men on either side of him looked away, deliberate, to give him the moment, because every one of them sitting on that bench had been a long, long time from anything at all that tasted like a kitchen a woman kept, and they knew what was happening to old Tomlin because it was happening, in its own degree, to each of them, and a man does not watch another man's face at a moment like that any more than he watches him pray. Lon Cruz ate without a word. He ate a full plate of the stew and 4 of the biscuits, and then he held his plate out to the side without lifting his eyes from it, and Cora came and filled it again, and he ate that too, every bite, and sopped the gravy with the last half biscuit. And the speech he had made on Friday night, the speech about how any woman alive could boil a pot of beans and feeding a gather was a whole other animal, and that there was not a wore-out widow's kind of work, that speech sat there in the warm room with all of them, plain as a chair, and nobody had to say one word about it, because the eating said the whole of it for him, and Lon Cruz knew it was being said, and he ate on with his ears gone a slow, dull red, and could not, for his life, look up the table to where she stood. When the men had slowed at last, when the platters had gone down to crumbs and the second pot of stew was scraped to its black bottom, Cora set the cobbler at the head of the table and cut it and spooned it out into the clean tin cups, the deep apple and the dark sorghum and the cracked brown crust, with a little of the hot apple syrup poured over each one. And outside the norther held its hand flat over the home pasture and screamed in the eaves, and inside 16 grown men ate dried apple cobbler in the warm and the lamplight, and somewhere down the bench somebody let out a long, slow breath, the kind a man lets out when a thing he had braced against turns out, against all his expectation, to be all right. And for a while that breath and the fire and the wind were the only sounds in the world. Aaron Vane had come in out of the weather without anyone marking it, and stood with his back against the cold board wall by the door, and he had watched the whole of it, from the bared heads to the last spoonful of syrup, and he could not move from the wall. He had watched his outfit, the men who rode for him and grumbled at him and would not bend so much as an inch for any soft thing under heaven, the hardest set of men in that hard country. He had watched them take off their hats for this woman without being asked, and sit down and eat what she set before them, like men who had come a very long way home and only just now understood that they were home. He had not known a kitchen could do that to a room full of hard men. He had known it once. He had forgotten it on purpose, the way he had forgotten a great many things on purpose after Ellen, when the going silent of the house had been a wound he kept open with his own 2 hands, deliberate every day, so that the wound could never heal over a thing he could not get back and leave him with the unbearable insult of having survived it. Now he stood with his shoulders against the cold boards and felt something rise in him that he had no name ready for and did not trust and could not stop. A loosening, a warmth coming up through him from the floor of him, a thing too much like hope to be safe, and he had spent 2 years making certain he was never anywhere near a thing like hope, and here it was, risen in him in his own kitchen at the sight of his men eating cobbler, and he could not put it back down. And then old Sweeney pushed back his chair from the end of the bench and turned around to face the room. He wiped his white mustache with the back of his hand. He got slowly to his bowed old legs. He looked across the warm, crowded kitchen to where Cora stood by the stove with the cobbler spoon still in her hand, and the whole long table felt the old man turn and quieted under it, because Sweeney did not often stand up to say a thing, and when he did, it was generally worth the standing. "I know you," he said. Every head along the bench came up. Cora went still by the stove. "I've been at it since Friday evening," Sweeney said, "worrying it like a dog worries a root. Where do I know that woman from? And it come to me in the night, plain as morning." His old eyes did not move off her face. "The Kansas Pacific grade, the spring of '81. I was hauling a beef contract up to the end of track camps that whole season, my last year of that kind of work before my knees quit me for the saddle. And there was a cook tent on the Saline River cut where the camp had lost its own cook to the fever, and a woman fed the whole gang after, fed 40 men twice a day off the ground, and the boys up and down that entire grade used to say it was the only camp on the line worth getting sick to eat at. The wind threw a fistful of sleet against the dark glass. Nobody moved. "That was you," Sweeney said. "It was not a question. That is your bread. I would know it anywhere on this green earth. I have eaten a great deal of bread in my time, ma'am, good and bad, and mostly bad, and a man forgets near all of it. I ate yours 3 weeks running on the Saline cut in the spring of '81, and I have not forgot it in 5 years, and I will not forget it now. And the minute I broke one of these here tonight, I knew the hand that made it before my head caught up to telling me how." Cora Halloran stood by the stove with the cobbler spoon in her hand, and the color came up slow and warm into her plain face. And for the first time since she had stepped down off the freight wagon into that yard, for the first time in this whole story, she looked as though she might not hold steady. Her eyes went bright. She did not let them spill, but they went bright, and the men saw it, and looked away the way they had looked away from Tomlin to give her the moment. "It was me," she said. Her voice was low and not quite even. "My husband took the fever on that grade. John. He's buried on it. I stayed on after and cooked because they needed feeding and I needed the wage, and there wasn't anywhere else in the world for me to go." Sweeney nodded, slow and grave, the way a man nods who is bearing witness to a truth in a church. "Then this here," he said, and he said it to the whole table now, to all of them, his old voice carrying, "is the luckiest outfit on the Sweetwater, and it has not got the sense yet to know what it's been handed." He turned his head and looked down the bench at Lon Cruz. "Has it, Cruz?" And Lon Cruz, wagon boss of the Willow Draw outfit, who had not lost an argument out loud in 15 hard years, and had told a tired widow to her face in front of every man at that table that feeding a gather was no work for her, looked down at his clean and empty plate and turned the fork over once beside it and said, low enough that a man had to lean in to catch it, "No, it surely don't." That was the turning of it. I want you to mark that it was not a speech that turned it, and it was not a plea, and it was not Cora standing up for herself, because she never once in this whole story stood up and made her own case. It was a plate of food and an old man's memory, and the truth coming out plain in a warm room, and the proudest man at the table eating his own words along with his cobbler, and finding, to his lasting surprise, that they went down easier than he had any right to expect. There is a thing some people learn late, and some never, that you cannot argue your worth into a room that is decided against you. You can only set it down in front of them, hot, and wait. She had waited. The waiting was over now. The norther blew itself out over 3 days, and in all of that time the outfit could not work the herd, because no man could sit a horse against that wind, and no cow would face it, and the cattle drifted with their tails to it, and bunched in the draws, and the men could do nothing but ride the fence lines when the wind dropped enough to let them, and keep the stock off the wire and out of the deep snow that was filling the low country. I want you to understand what those 3 days were like, because the worst of that winter is still ahead in this story, and you ought to know early what kind of weather these people were up against, so that you will know what it meant later that one plain woman's kitchen held a whole outfit together through it. The wind out of the northwest did not gust and fall the way ordinary wind does. It came on steady and unrelenting, hour on hour, day on day, a single great pressure leaning on the house like a living thing with its shoulder set against the wall, and it found every crack in the chinking and drove fine, dry snow through them in little hissing streams that built up in white drifts on the inside of the window sills. The cold was not a temperature, it was a thing with teeth, A man who pulled his glove to work a frozen latch lost the skin of his fingers to the iron. The water in the bucket by the door skinned over with ice 3 feet from the roaring stove. And through the whole of it, the wind made a sound in the eaves that the men said afterward they heard in their sleep for years, a high, steady mourning note with a deeper moan under it, the sound of the whole empty country crying out at once. And Pearl took to sleeping with her hands pressed over her ears until the dog learned to lie across the child's head like a second pillow and muffle it for her. Through 3 days of that, Cora kept the stove roaring and the kettle full and the coffee hot and never let the fire so much as gutter, day or night, because she understood, the way she understood most things, without anyone telling her, that the fire in that kitchen was the one thing standing between 16 men and the kind of cold that does not let go of what it takes. She fed them when they came in off the fence with their faces raw and their eyebrows white with frost, and their hands too stiff to hold a fork until they had thawed them an agonized minute over the stove. She wrapped hot stones from the hearth in flour sacking and sent them out in the wagon to the 2 men who had to stay out longest, minding the worst stretch of wire. She kept a pot of something hot going around the clock so that any man who came in at any hour of the day or the killing night found food ready and a fire up and a warm, dry place to put his frozen self. And she slept, when she slept at all, in snatches in the chair by the stove with the child in her lap, so that the fire would never once be left to die. And Cora fed those 16 men 3 full hot meals a day through the whole of the blow, out of that same kitchen. Biscuits and beans and beef and what cobbler and pie she could conjure from dried fruit, and by the end of the 3 days the whole matter of whether she would stay had been decided in the only court that holds any weight at all on a cattle ranch, which is the silent, unanimous court of the men who ride for the brand. There was no more talk of a wagon to the rail. Aaron Vane did not raise it, and Cora did not raise it. And when Monday came and went, there was no wagon to raise it about, because no freighter on God's earth was moving in that weather. But even after the roads opened, even when a man could have driven her down to Bitter Creek had anyone wished to, nobody wished to, and the thing was simply understood, the way the most important things on a ranch are most often the things never once put into words. A drifting cook turned up at the gate on the 2nd day of the blow, having heard somewhere down the line that the Willow Draw was short a koozie. He was a gray man with a war bag over his shoulder and a hopeful, beaten look about him, and he had walked a long, cold way for the chance. They could not turn a man out into that weather. They gave him a hot plate on the lee side of the porch out of the worst of the wind, and a place by the bunkhouse stove for the night. And in the morning, when the wind dropped, Aaron Vane gave him a silver dollar and pointed him on south. And on his way out, the gray man stopped where Aaron stood in the lee of the barn, and he jerked his thumb back at the kitchen, and he said that he had cooked 30 years in chuck wagons and town hotels both, and that he could not himself have laid down a finer feed in a warm city kitchen with a week to do it in, let alone in a ranch house in the dead middle of a 3-day norther, and that any man fool enough to let a cook like the one inside that house get away from him was a bigger kind of fool than the Lord generally permitted to keep good land. Aaron Vane did not tell the gray drifting cook that he had been, 11 days ago, within a single wagon ride of doing exactly that. He stood in the cold and watched the man trudge off down the white road, and he felt the foolishness of what he had nearly done settle into him slow, like a stone going down through still deep water, turning over, and a long time reaching the bottom. And there was a worse thought under that one, and Aaron Vane made himself look straight at it, standing there in the lee of the barn with the cold working into him, because he was a man who had learned to say the hard thing first. If the norther had held off 3 more days, the way northers sometimes do, hanging up on the divide and giving a man false hope, then he would have put Cora Halloran on the Monday wagon. He would have done it. He had been all but resolved on it. The wagon would have carried her and the child down to Bitter Creek, and the storm would have caught the gather out on the open range with no cook and no hot food waiting, and not one thing standing between his men and the worst weather any of them had ever ridden. And he did not let himself flinch from where that thought went next, because some of those men would not have come home. He knew it the way he knew the country. A cold man can ride a long way toward a fire he knows is burning. He cannot ride that far toward a cold, dark house and a wagon track going away south. The plain woman he had nearly sent down the road had not just fed his outfit a fine supper. She had, without ever once knowing she was doing it, without a soul telling her the stakes, kept his men alive. And she had done it with the very meal he had asked her to cook, half as a sneer, bracing himself for her to fail. He stood in the cold a long while with that. And when he went in at last, he could not look at her any easier than Lon Cruz could. Lon Cruz came to her on the third morning of the blow. She was carrying water up from the well, 2 buckets swinging from a yoke across her shoulders, and the wind, dropping now but not yet done, was trying its level best to take her bonnet off her head. And Lon Cruz came across the trampled snow of the yard and lifted the yoke off her shoulders without a word, the way he might have done for his own mother, and carried the water himself, and set the buckets down by the kitchen stove. And then he stood in the middle of her warmed kitchen with his hat held against his chest in both hands, like a boy hauled up before a schoolmaster, and he got out the thing he had walked across the yard to say. "I said a low thing about you, ma'am, Friday night a week back, in front of the whole outfit. And it was a small thing to say, and it was untrue, and I've had it sitting in my craw ever since I broke that first biscuit. I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me take it back." Cora looked at him a moment across the steam rising off the wash kettle. She could have made him stand in it. She had earned the right to make him stand in it, and a smaller person would have, and no one in that country would have blamed her. Instead, she went to the back of the stove and took down a plate she had kept warm there since before light, a plate she had set aside that morning without telling a soul why she was setting it aside or who it was for, because she had known, somehow, the way she knew a norther was coming, that this man would come across that yard to her before the day was out. Biscuits and stew and a thick slab of the cobbler, and she put the warm plate into his 2 hands. "You rode 2 nights on the ground in the cold," she said, "same as the others, and you've eat standin' up for 3 days helpin' mind the fence. Sit down and eat your breakfast, Mr. Cruz. We'll call it square." And Lon Cruz, wagon boss of the Willow Draw, sat down at her long table and ate his breakfast, and for some reason he could not name and would not have admitted to under torture, he could not bring himself to look square at her the whole time he did it. What the long, sleepless night of the gather had cost her, Cora did not speak of to anyone, and only Pearl, who slept curled against her mother's side, knew that Cora lay awake a long time in the dark after Sweeney had stood up and named the Saline cut in front of the whole outfit, and that twice in the night she said John Halloran's name aloud to the dark rafters, soft, the way a woman finally sets down a thing she has carried too far and too long and lets it rest in the dirt at last. Sweeney's words had opened a grave that Cora had kept covered for the plain practical sake of getting through her days, because a person cannot cook breakfast for 16 men with an open grave in the room, and so she had kept it shut and gone on. And now the old man had opened it with 5 kind words in a warm kitchen, and the grief of it ran in her fresh that night as though John had died 9 days ago and not a year and a half. The fever camp, and the 9 days of it, and the doctor who would not come, and the hard prairie row with the stones too small for the names, and the line foreman with his ledger and his 3 silver dollars and his week's notice to a widow with a child. She had cooked her way through every hour of all of it, because cooking was the one single thing the wide world would still pay a widow to do. And somewhere out on that long grade, she had quietly stopped letting herself believe that she would ever again cook in a kitchen that was hers, in a house where she was anything more than the woman who fed the men and was forgotten the moment the plates went clean. She lay there in the dark of the Willow Draw ranch house, with her sleeping girl warm against her and the one-eyed dog a warm weight across her feet, and she let herself, for the first time in 2 long years, want a thing. It frightened her worse than the empty road south ever had. The empty road had asked nothing of her but to keep walking. Wanting a thing asked her to risk it. But she let herself want it anyway, lying there, the warm kitchen, the work that was hers, the man's slow thawing, the child safe and growing, a place. She wanted it so hard in the dark that it stopped her breath. And then she did what she had always done with everything in her life that frightened her. She rose the next morning before the first gray light, the same as she did every morning she had ever lived, and she built the fire, and she set the bread, because wanting a thing and earning a thing were two entirely different matters, and Cora Halloran had only ever once in her life trusted the second of the two, and never once the first. She earned it through the rest of that hard fall and into the winter, which was the worst winter that country had ever seen or would see again in the lifetime of any man then living. The norther of the gather had only been the front rider of it. The snow came and did not melt, and came again, and the cold sank down and stayed and deepened week on week until the cattle could not paw down to the cured grass under the crust and began to drift and die in the draws, and that whole northern range from the Dakotas to the Divide lost its herds by the tens of thousands, and big outfits that had counted their stock in the thousands counted them after in the hundreds, and the bones of it lay out on the spring grass for years. The men called it afterward, in the hushed way men name a disaster they barely outlived, the Great Die-Up, and they reckoned their lives by before it and after it. The Willow Draw came through it better than most, though not whole, because no outfit came through that winter whole. And the reason it came through it all was partly Aaron Vane's cattleman's sense, which had counted his exposure on a port step in the first cold, and had moved his weakest stock down into the sheltered home pasture and the willow bottoms early, and partly, in a way none of the men would ever quite put words to, but all of them somehow knew, it was the kitchen. Because a man can ride out into killing cold to chop ice off a waterhole or break a path through a drift to pen stock if he knows, all the while his face is freezing to the bone, that there is a hot meal and a warm room and a fire waiting at the end of the ride. And he cannot do it, not day on day on day through the worst winter in living memory, if there is not. The kitchen of the Willow Draw kept the men, and the men kept the herd, as much of it as God and the weather left to keep. And so it was no great stretch to say, and Sweeney said it more than once that winter, that the plain widow who had been told to think about the Monday wagon had carried that outfit through the die-up on her own 2 raw red hands. The men learned her. They learned to scrape their own plates into the wreck pan without being told, and to bring her dry split wood before she had to ask for it, and to mind their tongues at her table, and the young ones took to bringing her things they could not have explained the bringing of. A fat sage hen one of them knocked down with a thrown rock and carried in proud as a suitor. A whole length of red ribbon that the boy Deke, of all people, who had bet Plug Tobacco that she'd be gone by Monday, bought off the shelf at the store in Rollins when they freighted in for stores in a thaw, and gave to Pearl with his ears gone scarlet, and could not for the life of him have told you why he had done it. The child worked her own slow way into Aaron Vane through that long winter, the way the dog had worked its way to Cora. Pearl took to riding up on the wagon seat beside her mother when Cora freighted out a hot dinner to the men minding the far fence in the worst of it, and she carried the tin cups out to them 2 at a time the way she had that first supper, and the hard cases who would have frozen solid before they cooed over a child found themselves saving her the heel of a biscuit and lifting her up to see over the rail of the corral, and the boy Tobe, who stammered, taught her to whistle through a blade of grass held between her 2 thumbs, and did not stammer once the whole time he taught her, having found in the small grave child the one person on the place who never once seemed to be waiting on his words. One bitter evening near the dead of that winter, Aaron Vane came on the girl asleep in the back of the wagon under a tarp with the one-eyed dog beside her, the 2 of them worn clean out from a long, cold day of carrying dinner to the fence riders. And he stood over her a while in the blue dark with the cold coming down, and then he took off his own heavy coat and laid it over the both of them, child, and dog, and tucked it down at the edges, the rough, careful way a man tucks in a thing he is not yet certain he has any earthly right to tuck in. And Pearl woke just enough to look up at him out of her mother's same steady eyes and to say, "Thank you, Mr. Vane," and to go back under. And Aaron Vane stood out there in the killing cold with no coat on for a long while after, longer than was sensible, and felt the wall he had built up stone by stone these 2 years come down a course of stones in the dark, and he let it come down, and did not lay the stones back, and went in at last cold to the bone, and warmer somewhere under it than he had been in 2 years. In a thaw in the deep of that winter, a cattle buyer came up from the railroad, a brisk, well-fed man named Harmon, to look at what stock the country had left to sell, and he stopped a night at the Willow Draw, and ate at Cora's table, 2 suppers and a breakfast, and on the morning he left, he found her alone in the kitchen, and made her an offer. He had a brother, he said, who kept a good hotel down in Cheyenne, a fine new place with a dining room that wanted a cook who could feed a crowd, and feed them well, and he would pay her $30 a month, and her room, and her board, and the child's keep besides, more than twice a top hand's wage, to come down and cook in a warm town kitchen, with a roof that never leaked, and a floor she would never have to freight a dinner out across in the snow, and he laid it out plain and fair, and meant every word of it. Cora heard him out to the end, because he had been a guest at her table and courtesy was owed. And then she thanked him, plain, and told him no. She told him she had found the place she meant to stay. She did not say more than that, and Harmon, who was a shrewd man, looked from her steady plain face to where Aaron Vane stood out in the dog trot, pretending very hard to be busy with a bridle and not to be listening. And a slow understanding came over the cattle buyer's well-fed face, and he smiled under his mustache and let the whole matter lie, and never once asked her twice. Aaron Vane had heard the offer through the open door and had heard her turn it down, and he carried that all the long, cold way through the rest of that winter, the $30 she had said no to and the few quiet words she had said it with. He could not any more make himself sorry for one single thing about the day she had stepped down into his yard with her bag in the frozen dust. Not the day, not the child, not the wagon he had nearly put her on. He turned it over and over, the way she had turned his 4-line letter over on the road north, reading the spaces between the words. And what he read in the spaces at last, near the far end of that long winter, was that he had been given a thing he had stopped believing the world would ever again let him have, and that he had very nearly, out of pure stubborn grief, sent it back down the road to the depot. He waited for the winter to break. He was not a hand at this kind of thing, and never had been, not even with Ellen, who had done most of the saying for the both of them while she lived, and he wanted the worst of the cold behind them, and the men paid off and gone to other ranges for the season's work, and the yard quiet, before he tried to find the words. It broke in March, the way that winter finally broke, all at once and grudging, the snow going gray and rotten and the draws running brown and loud, and the first hard green coming up through the dead grass and the new calves dropping on the warm afternoons. And on an evening near the end of the calving, with the yard gone quiet and the first soft, real spring rain coming down straight and gentle in the windless dark, Aaron Vane came into the kitchen and found Cora there setting the bread to rise for the morning, her sleeves shoved up past her elbows and flour to her wrists, and Pearl long since asleep in the next room with the dog stretched across her doorway. And he stood in the kitchen doorway the way he had stood in it that very first day, except that it was a different man standing in the doorway now, and they both of them knew it, and the knowing was in the room with them. "Mrs. Halloran," he said, and then he stopped, because he was no hand at this. He looked at the floor, and he looked at the bread, and he started again. "Cora." She turned from the bread and waited, her white floured hands going still in the dough, and she did not help him, because she knew it was a thing he had to get out on his own, or it would not be worth the having. "I sent off for a woman to keep my house and feed my men," he said. "That was the bargain I wrote you. 4 lines. That was the whole of what I let myself want, because I'd quit on wanting anything bigger than that a long while back, and I'd got good at the quitting, better than was good for me." He turned his hat once, slow, in his hands. I'm asking you now for a thing I never put in any letter and never thought I'd ask any living woman for again. I'm asking you to stay. Not the cook, not the wife I bargained for over a banknote in an envelope. You, Cora Halloran. I'd be a poorer man every day I had left to live if you ever went down that road, and I have known it since before the snow and been too much a coward and too long a widower to say it. He made himself look up from the hat and meet her eyes. I know I'm a hard place for a body to come to rest. I know what I made of myself these 2 years and what I said to you in this yard your first hour on it, and I'll carry the shame of that as long as I live. But I'd spend whatever's left in me trying to be a better man than the one who said it, if you'd have me try. Cora wiped her hands slow down the front of her apron. She had crossed near 1,000 miles of her own grief to a yard where a man looked her up and down over the wheel of a freight wagon, and a wagon boss called her somebody's wore-out aunt in front of the whole outfit. She had been told she was the wrong woman before ever she set her bag down in the dust. She had cooked a roomful of frozen men out of their certainty, one biscuit at a time, and earned every bared head and every length of red ribbon and every scraped clean plate the only way she had ever in her life trusted, which was the hard way, the earned way, twice over and then again. And now there was this, the thing she had not let herself want until a night in the dark when she had wanted it so hard it stopped her breath, being held out to her plain across a warm and lamp-lit kitchen by the very man who had nearly sent it away. She did not weep. She had wept enough in the dark to last a woman 2 lifetimes, and this was not a thing made for weeping. This was a thing made for the truth, which was all she had ever had to bargain with, and all she had ever needed. "John was a good man," she said. "I'll not pretend he wasn't, and I'll not pretend my heart is mended all the way through, because it isn't, and a man who'd want me to say otherwise wouldn't be worth the saying it to." She looked at him steady, the plain, steady look that had not once left her face from the moment she climbed down off the wagon into a yard that did not want her. "But it's mending, Mr. Vane, Aaron. It has been mending since the night your men took off their hats, and it has gone on mending all this hard winter in this warm room, and I did not look to have it mend, and it has." She drew a breath. "I'll stay. I came west to keep from going under. I would a great deal sooner stay because I'm wanted." And Aaron Vane crossed his own kitchen floor and took her 2 flowered white hands up in his 2 hard brown ones, and outside the soft spring rain came down straight and gentle on the willow draw, and the home pasture, and the long road south that no one in that house would ever travel again, and inside the lamp burned warm and steady in the window, and the bread rose slow on the back of the stove for the morning that was already on its way up out of the dark. They were married in the front room of Mrs. Avery's house in Rawlins 2 weeks before the calving was done, with Mrs. Avery herself weeping happily into her good handkerchief at having had a hand in it from the first line of the notice, and old Sweeney standing up as witness in a stiff collar that was very near to strangling him, and that he tugged at all through the ceremony, and Lon Cruz in the second row of chairs holding his hat against his chest with both hands, and Pearl in a new blue dress with the boy Deke's red ribbon tied in her hair, and the one-eyed dog waiting out in the wagon in the spring sun because no power on earth would have kept it home. The country that had said the fall before that the Willow Draw stockman had sent off for a cook and got himself saddled with a plain widow and another man's child, the same country found, once it had eaten at her table the one time at the wedding supper, that it had a good deal less to say on the matter than it had thought it did, and that what little it had left to say, it had better say quiet. By that first summer there was a garden broken and planted, and coming up green where Ellen Vane's old beds had gone over to weeds and snow, and Ellen's sewing basket had been brought down from the high shelf at last and given a true place of honor on the mantel where the light caught it, and Ellen's hairbrush had been wrapped careful in soft cloth and put away gentle in a drawer for Pearl to have one day when she was grown, because Cora Halloran did not believe in shoving the dead aside to make herself room in a house, but only in living so well and so warm in the house the dead had left behind that the dead themselves, if they could see, would be glad of who had come to keep it. The kitchen of the Willow Draw became, and stayed for 30 years, the warmest room in all that part of the country, and the hands who rode for that brand were the best fed and the most loyal outfit on the whole of the Sweetwater, and they would have ridden through fire for the woman who cooked for them, and once or twice, in hard years that came after, one or another of them very nearly did, and counted it no more than fair. Cora Halloran Vane had come to a place that did not want her, and she had not begged it to want her, and she had not shamed it into changing its mind, and she had never once in all of it stood up and made a speech in her own defense. She had tied on a dead man's apron over her own, and lit a cold stove, and fed a roomful of frozen men until they took their hats off, and in the feeding of them she had been seen, at the long last of it, for exactly what she had always been and always would be, which was a woman of plain and stubborn and unshowy worth that the wide, busy world had simply never once troubled itself to stop and look at. She had not changed. That is the thing to carry away from it, if you carry away one thing. The woman who walked out of Mrs. Avery's front room on Aaron Vane's arm, the mistress of a Sweetwater ranch, was the very same woman who had set her worn carpetbag down in the frozen dust of that yard with both hands and a kind of care, the same in every particular. What had changed was not Cora. What had changed was that she was home at last, in a house she kept warm with her own two hands, beside a man who had learned, the hardest way a man can learn it, how to want a good thing again, and how to be worthy of the wanting, and a child with her own steady eyes growing up safe and whistling through a blade of grass, and a fire she would never again in this life have to let go cold. And on the bitter nights, the rest of her long life, when the norther came up out of the northwest and laid the grass flat and rattled the glass in the window frames and screamed in the eaves the way it had screamed the first night she ever baked in that kitchen, the lamp burned in the window of the Willow Draw, and there was bread set to rise on the back of the stove, and there was hot black coffee on the trivet for any cold and weary soul who came up that long road out of the dark and the weather, whoever they were and whether the world had ever troubled to look at them or not. Because she, of all people, knew what it was to come up a frozen road at the end of everything, with nowhere to fall, and find a lit window and a warm room and a plate set down in front of you, hot, by a pair of hands that asked you for nothing first, but that you come in out of it and sit down. That was the whole of what Cora Halloran had ever wanted, and it was a very great deal more than she had once, on a long road north with $4 and a sleeping child and a 4-line letter read soft to pieces, ever let herself believe that the world would allow a plain woman like her to have. There is a grave on a rise above the Sweetwater country, where I started, and now you know the woman under it, and you know why the man who told her to her face that she was the wrong woman rode 40 miles through a killing snow to fetch a doctor when her time came hard, and wept at the foot of her bed like a child, and kept her stove warm for 30 winters after she was gone, because he could not bear, having once let it go cold and lived behind the cold of it for 2 long years, to ever let it go cold again. He kept the lamp lit in the window, too, all those 30 years, on the bitter nights, for any cold soul that might come up the road. He said, when the young hands asked him why an old widower kept a lamp burning and bread rising in a kitchen with no woman left in it to cook, that he had learned it from the best cook on the Sweetwater, and that she had learned it on a road harder than any of them would ever ride, and that a man does not let a thing like that go cold once he has been lucky enough to be warmed by it. And that is the end of it. The end of a thing is no place to start, which is why I started where I did, but it is exactly the place to stop, so I will stop there, with the lamp lit in the window, and the bread rising, and the long road out of the dark, for once, leading somebody home.